All right, so I have a longer or shorter version of this. In view of the time, I'll probably skip most of the details and go to the shorter version. So I'm a Western trained scientist. I come out of the Western science tradition, which is something that Vine Deloria correctly characterized as often dismissive of indigenous knowledge or even hostile to it. And so, given that, the work that I'm going to briefly profile led me to indigenous knowledge. Even though I'm coming from Western science, which is hostile to indigenous knowledge, an open-minded approach to this took me straight to indigenous knowledge. And that may not be surprising, given the work was about how to live in this place, which is essentially indigenous. But I would suggest that perhaps a better approach, and I'll conclude with this at the end, is to start with indigenous knowledge and to build how to live in this place or how to live in any place with the knowledge that's indigenous to that place. All right, let me take a step back. So we all know that colonizing societies tend to try to take more from the places they occupy than those places can sustain. And as that continues, then eventually that can lead to ecological collapse. We've seen that in many places, and we're seeing it now at a global scale. And so recently, a large group of prominent Western scientists tried to evaluate those consequences at a global scale. And what they tried to do is to determine what are the limits to how much humanity can take from the Earth before we risk ecological collapse, essentially before we get kicked off of the planet. And you might think about that and saying, well, that's actually a noble pursuit of trying to define where are the limits and how much Western society or industrialized society has exceeded those limits, so maybe we can come back a little bit. It could also be seen as what Vine Deloria characterized as Western science really acting in service of exploitative societies, in this case to figure out how much we can take from the Earth. And so they pursued that line of thought, and they then evaluated or determined 11 essential processes that are necessary to Earth system function, you could call it, or simply life on Earth. And then they looked a little closer and determined that and they determined limits within which we have to live before we risk ecological collapse. And when we're talking about ecological collapse, we're talking about collapse. We can no longer live here, and neither can many of our other non-human relatives. And then they determined that we have actually already exceeded most of those boundaries. Right? Yep. And they put numbers on how much we've exceeded those boundaries. Related to that, just about a year and a half ago, a few scientists came out and tried to figure out, okay, what is the mass of the technosphere, which is really the amount of the Earth that industrialized society have converted to stuff. That make sense? And they did a rough estimate and came out to a figure of 28 trillion tons, right? Other folks came out with an estimate of the mass of the biosphere, the mass of living things left on the planet. And that number was 4 trillion tons. So if you think about it, what industrialized society has done is converted most of the life on Earth into non-living stuff, right? And now what we're talking about is what happens, what do we do about the rest of it? How much more of that can we convert to material possessions before, the whole thing collapses? So I looked at that work. It was published in the highest science journals in the world, and said, well, what are you going to do about that? If you look at the Paris Climate Accords, indigenous peoples were kicked out of the room. They weren't allowed to participate in those accords, which were trying to do something about the limit of one of the boundaries. And so how is delineating these 11 boundaries actually going to help us to live here? Because we have a really hard time doing things at a global level. And certainly for indigenous peoples of a particular place, global limits really don't help. And so I decided, well, what would that look like at a regional scale? And I picked the Nooksack River Basin, right? What would those, if I could translate what those folks came up with at the global scale down to a regional scale where we actually might be able to do something about it, what would it look like? And so that's where, well, first of all, translating those boundaries down to a regional level, what I found was what you need to do is consider hydrologic processes, which is indigenous knowledge, right? We all know that we're all connected by water. And so that sort of made sense, but indigenous peoples knew that already. And then I tried to figure out, okay, if you translate those 11 boundaries, or at least the ones that have local relevance, if you're talking about climate change and the amount of greenhouse gases or carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere, that's really a global process. And so we're looking really more at local things. Of those, most of the processes or variables that you translate from the global scale, the best information came from the State of the Watershed reports from the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission and other information produced by indigenous peoples. And so I went, did all that, and found that of the 6 boundaries in this basin, in the Nooksack, we've already exceeded 5, and we're at the very limit of the 6th. Right? The 6th is forest cover, how much forest cover is left here, and we're at the very limit beyond which we risk ecological collapse. And the longer version would involve, okay, what are those 11, what are those 6, but I think I'll skip that. So that means we're in a danger zone. We've exceeded the limits of life in this area. The policies and procedures that it would take to restore life within the safe zone, if you want to call it that, are already in place. But they've been applied to further exceed the boundaries. They've been applied to further convert more of life into stuff. Right? The consequences, I guess examples of that would be the county's comprehensive plan, in which we're figuring out, okay, how can we pave over more land and how can we cut down more forest? The Hearst decision fix, in which we're basically figuring out how to extract more water from the river. Those are examples of policies misapplied to make the problem worse. The consequences of this are pretty severe. We're talking about irreversible disruption of river functions. Right, so the rivers no longer function like the rivers that have been here, since in indigenous people's memories. We're talking about severe human health impacts, about contaminated shellfish. You already know what that looks like, and salmon extinctions. We're talking about losing salmon here, and that's a consequence of decisions being made now, have been made over a century, but continue to be made with the knowledge of what those consequences are. The Lummi people in particular have taken a number of initiatives to try and restore safety, to push us back towards the boundaries. And I'll let Tim knows about those better than I do, but that's very encouraging, but we really need the rest of society participating too. And I would, again, what I've done is basically delimited, okay, what are the limits within which we must live in this place? And how far have we exceeded those limits? I would suggest actually a much better approach would be to start with Indigenous knowledge in an entirely different way of thinking about the problem, right? What I've described, what people have done at the global level, and there have been a number of national and now regional level analyses, have been to basically find what are the limits of safety, right? Which, if you want to get cynical, you could say that's really asking how much can we take before we go too far? Really what that is how much can we shrink the world and still be able to be here? I would suggest a much better approach would be to start with Indigenous knowledge involving reciprocal relationships. And then we're not talking about how much can we take, but we're also talking about we're in relationship, right? We receive, but we also give back. And if we think about that, then we're not talking about how much can we take from the world, how much can we shrink the world. We're talking about how much can we work with our other inhabitants and how much can we grow the world. And I think that is a much more hopeful process than saying, right, we've just jumped off the cliff. Are we really going to hit the bottom? Or can we get back before we fall? It's really, no, it's a much more hopeful idea of how can we change how we operate in the world, restore our relationships with the world, and actually grow what has been lost. And at the very center of that is Indigenous knowledge. And so that's why I argue Indigenous knowledge is the key to a path to the future. Thank you.